At 94 years old, Clint Eastwood has lived through decades of Hollywood history, shaping the very culture he once entered as a young actor. But there's one story that's lingered for years, one that's been whispered about, speculated on, and even debated by fans and critics alike: the complicated relationship between Clint and John Wayne. For years, Clint Eastwood kept his thoughts about the legendary Duke close to the chest, never fully addressing the rumored rivalry, the criticisms, or the impact Wayne had on his career. That is, until now. In a rare moment of reflection, Clint has finally broken his silence. What did he say? And what does it mean for the legacy of two of the biggest icons in film history? Stay tuned as we uncover Clint Eastwood's long-awaited comments on John Wayne, the real story behind their relationship, and why it matters more today than ever before. In the golden era of Western cinema, two names stood tall: John Wayne, the embodiment of the traditional cowboy hero, and Clint Eastwood, the rising star introducing a grittier, more complex portrayal of the Wild West. Fans and industry insiders alike speculated about a potential collaboration between these titans, envisioning a film that would merge the old and new schools of Western storytelling. The opportunity seemed to present itself in the early 1970s when Eastwood, eager to work alongside Wayne, sent him a script for a project titled The Hostiles. The film aimed to blend their distinct styles, offering a narrative that could bridge their differing cinematic philosophies. Eastwood's vision was to create a Western that acknowledged the moral complexities of its characters, a departure from the clear-cut heroism often depicted in Wayne's films. However, Wayne was not receptive to the proposal. He reportedly took issue with the script's tone and themes, feeling that it undermined the values he believed the Western genre should uphold. Wayne's rejection was not merely a professional decision, but also a reflection of his disapproval of the direction in which Eastwood was taking the genre. Eastwood, undeterred, revised the script and sent it to Wayne once more, hoping to find common ground. Yet, Wayne remained steadfast in his refusal, allegedly expressing his disdain in colorful terms and dismissing the project outright. This second rejection solidified the divide between the two actors, making it clear that a collaboration was unlikely. The missed opportunity for a joint venture between Wayne and Eastwood became a topic of discussion among fans and critics. Many lamented what could have been a landmark film in Western cinema, combining the gravitas of Wayne's traditional hero with Eastwood's nuanced anti-hero. The absence of such a collaboration left a void, a tantalizing what-if in Hollywood history. In retrospect, the failed attempt to unite these two legends on screen highlights the broader transition within the Western genre. Wayne represented the classic, idealized vision of the West, where good and evil were clearly defined, and heroes embodied unwavering moral codes. Eastwood, conversely, introduced a more ambiguous portrayal, where characters grappled with inner demons and moral dilemmas, reflecting a changing societal perspective. The divergence in their cinematic approaches underscored a generational shift in storytelling. While Wayne clung to the romanticized ideals of the past, Eastwood embraced the complexities of the present, challenging audiences to reconsider their perceptions of heroism and justice. This ideological rift not only prevented a collaboration, but also symbolized the evolving nature of American cinema. Ultimately, the story of the unmade film The Hostiles serves as a poignant reminder of the challenges that arise when differing artistic visions collide. It encapsulates a moment in film history where tradition met innovation, and the resulting tension left an indelible mark on the legacy of both John Wayne and Clint Eastwood. Clint Eastwood and John Wayne were both Western legends, but they were riding in completely different directions. To the casual viewer, they might have seemed cut from the same cloth, tough, stoic, and synonymous with dusty saloons and gunslinging justice. But underneath that surface was a deep philosophical divide about what the American West really meant and how it should be portrayed on screen. John Wayne believed in the traditional Western hero, uncomplicated, morally upright, and always fighting for the right side. His characters were often idealized, painted in broad strokes of honor and patriotism. In his view, Westerns were about preserving those core American values, even if they glossed over the messier parts of history. Wayne's West was black and white, good versus evil, and there was comfort in that simplicity. Eastwood, however, was steering into gray areas, and that didn't sit well with Wayne. By the time Clint was directing his own Westerns, he was challenging every trope the genre had relied on for decades. His characters weren't heroes in shining spurs. They were flawed, brooding, often violent men haunted by their pasts. In movies like High Plains Drifter and Unforgiven, Eastwood introduced a version of the West that was dirty, brutal, and morally ambiguous. And that's where the conflict really began. Wayne saw Eastwood's gritty realism as a threat, not just to the genre, but to the myth of the American cowboy itself. He thought Clint's films made pioneers look like savages and questioned the nobility of frontier life. Where Eastwood was tearing down legends, Wayne was still trying to build them. This fundamental disagreement wasn't just about movies, it was personal. Wayne reportedly criticized Eastwood behind the scenes, saying his films were cynical and destructive. He didn't appreciate the moral questioning or the darker undertones Clint was weaving into his narratives. To Wayne, Eastwood's work lacked honor. To Eastwood, Wayne's films lacked honesty. Their divide reflected something bigger happening in American culture. The country was changing, grappling with the Vietnam War, civil rights, and political corruption. Audiences were beginning to question authority and tradition. Eastwood's revisionist westerns echoed that mood perfectly. But Wayne, well into his later years, clung to a vision of the past that no longer resonated with younger viewers. Even though they were never at war publicly, the tension was undeniable. They became symbols of two competing Americas, one holding tightly to its myths, and the other trying to reckon with its truths. Clint Eastwood didn't set out to challenge John Wayne directly, but by simply making the films he believed in, he drew a line in the sand. And as the industry shifted toward Eastwood's darker, more reflective tone, Wayne found himself increasingly out of step with modern audiences. But that didn't mean he was done fighting back. Behind the curtain of Hollywood legend lies a story not many fans know. A personal letter that became the defining moment of tension between Clint Eastwood and John Wayne. It wasn't a phone call. It wasn't an in-person confrontation. It was ink on paper, direct, unmistakable, and scathing. After rejecting Clint's offer to co-star in Hostiles, John Wayne didn't just walk away. He sat down and wrote a letter. But this wasn't a polite decline or a casual dismissal. Wayne wanted Eastwood to know exactly what he thought of his vision, and he didn't hold back. The letter has never been officially published, but insiders close to both men confirmed its contents were sharp and deeply critical. Wayne reportedly tore into the script, calling it offensive to the spirit of the American West. He believed Eastwood's take was too dark, too cynical, and disrespectful to the values that Westerns were built on. But it wasn't just about the story. Wayne was attacking the message. In his eyes, Clint's film suggested that the frontier heroes weren't honorable men, but killers and broken souls. To Wayne, that was a betrayal, not just of the genre, but of America itself. The tone of the letter was more than professional criticism. It was personal ideology. Wayne, who had always aligned himself with traditionalist, conservative values, saw Clint's grittier vision as dangerous. He accused Eastwood of corrupting the minds of young viewers, painting pioneers as violent and unstable instead of courageous and noble. It was clear John Wayne wasn't just turning down a script. He was drawing a line in the sand. Clint Eastwood, always more reserved, never fired back publicly. But those close to him said the letter made an impression. Not in the way Wayne might have hoped, though. Clint didn't change his direction. If anything, he leaned into it harder. He went on to make some of the most morally complex Westerns of all time, using silence, ambiguity, and violence to challenge the black and white thinking Wayne championed. For fans of both men, the letter became a symbol of a greater cultural clash, the old world versus the new, tradition versus evolution. Wayne stood for what Westerns used to be, clean, heroic, and idealized. Eastwood stood for what they were becoming, raw, uncertain, and uncomfortable. And with that letter, any chance of reconciliation between the two icons disappeared. But there's another layer to this. While Wayne might have written the letter to scold or correct, it also revealed something deeper, his fear. Fear that the genre he helped build was slipping away. Fear that audiences were embracing a darker truth over his romanticized myths. And fear that Clint Eastwood, the quiet gunslinger from a new generation, was leading that charge. And as it turned out, Clint wasn't done rewriting the rules, not by a long shot. By the late 1970s, Clint Eastwood was no longer just the mysterious stranger on horseback. He was becoming one of Hollywood's most respected filmmakers. While John Wayne was still holding tight to the classic Western image, Clint had quietly begun reshaping the genre from the director's chair. And it wasn't subtle. His approach was bold, unflinching, and it rattled the very foundation of the stories Wayne had spent a lifetime telling. Clint's directorial style was a far cry from the polished, patriotic tone of Wayne's era. His characters were quiet, dangerous, and often morally gray. Instead of riding in to save the town, they might leave it in ruins. Instead of noble sacrifice, there was vengeance. In films like High Plains Drifter and The Outlaw Josie Wales, Clint made it clear this wasn't your grandfather's cowboy fantasy. This was the West, raw, ugly, and real. What made Eastwood's rise as a director so impactful wasn't just his talent, it was the timing. Audiences were changing. They were growing skeptical of heroes who seemed too clean, too perfect. They didn't want to be told what was right and wrong. They wanted to feel the struggle for themselves. Clint gave them that, and he didn't flinch when it got uncomfortable. He also did something Wayne never really could. He blurred the lines between hero and villain. In Pale Rider, Eastwood played a ghostly preacher who may have been a murderer in a past life. In Unforgiven, he portrayed a retired gunslinger who returned to violence, not for justice, but for revenge. These weren't clear-cut protagonists. They were complicated men who made audiences question their loyalty. And here's what made Clint's rise even more remarkable. He never asked for approval. While Wayne spent much of his later career defending traditional values and criticizing modern trends, Eastwood just kept creating. He didn't push back against Wayne in interviews or start public feuds. He let his work speak for itself, and the box office listened. One of the most powerful examples of Clint's vision came with Unforgiven in 1992. The film was a masterclass in dismantling the old Western myths. There were no heroes, no honorable shootouts, no triumphant endings, just regret, blood, and the cost of violence. It was the kind of story Wayne never would have touched, and yet it won 4 Academy Awards, including Best Picture and Best Director for Eastwood. That success sent a message. The Western didn't need to die, but it needed to evolve. And Clint Eastwood was the one leading that evolution. He wasn't just revising the genre. He was redefining it. Still, as Eastwood's reputation soared, the shadow of John Wayne never completely disappeared. Critics and fans kept comparing them, kept asking what Wayne would have thought of this new, darker direction. And Clint? He stayed silent, at least publicly. Until now. By the time the 1990s rolled around, Clint Eastwood had earned his seat among the greats, not just as an actor, but as a filmmaker with a clear, unapologetic voice. Meanwhile, John Wayne had already passed away in 1979, leaving behind a towering legacy of over 170 films. But even in death, Wayne's influence didn't fade. In fact, it sparked a growing question that hovered over Eastwood's career like a shadow. Whose version of the West would endure? What makes this rivalry so intriguing is that it wasn't fueled by headlines or tabloid drama. It was a battle of ideologies. Wayne's America was carved in stone, patriotic, confident, and unwavering in its moral compass. Eastwood's vision, however, was carved in scars, rough-edged, introspective, and haunted by past sins. These weren't just different storytelling styles. They were 2 conflicting interpretations of American identity. For decades, critics and fans alike compare the 2 legends, often framing Clint as the anti-Wayne. Not because he hated the Duke, but because his work rejected the clean narrative Wayne had cemented. And Clint didn't flinch when those comparisons came up. He never trashed Wayne's films. In fact, he often acknowledged his impact on cinema. But Clint made it equally clear he wasn't following in anyone's footsteps. He was carving his own trail, one unpredictable choice at a time. The tension between their legacies became even more dramatic when Eastwood started receiving accolades Wayne never did. Despite his decades of stardom, John Wayne only won 1 Oscar for True Grit. Eastwood, by contrast, racked up Academy Awards as both a director and producer. Unforgiven, Million Dollar Baby, and later works like Mystic River and Gran Torino prove that Clint wasn't just a Western star. He was a storyteller who could transcend genres, time periods, and cultural shifts. And yet, even as Eastwood redefined Hollywood standards, Wayne's image remained firmly rooted in American nostalgia. Flags still waved for him. His quotes were still printed on mugs, his face etched into the iconography of American masculinity. It was as if time had frozen the Duke in his prime, immune to criticism or reflection. But Eastwood wasn't afraid of reflection. In fact, he leaned into it. He took the gunslinging legend and asked, what happens when he's old, tired, and full of regret? That question haunted Unforgiven, a film that many saw as Eastwood's quiet answer to everything Wayne stood for. It was a Western about consequences, about the cost of killing, even when it's justified. In one subtle, devastating line, Eastwood's character says, "We all have it coming, kid." That wasn't just a line. It was a philosophy. And it cut straight through the heroic mythology Wayne had spent his life building. And while John Wayne may have never had the chance to respond to that evolution, the industry certainly did. Audiences were no longer cheering for simple heroes. They wanted truth, even if it hurt. And that shift was undeniable. But here's the twist. Despite their differences, there was one thing Clint Eastwood never forgot about John Wayne. On the surface, it looked like Clint Eastwood and John Wayne were on opposite ends of a cultural battlefield. One stood for unshaken tradition, the other for uncomfortable truths. But underneath the quiet tension and ideological differences, there was something else that most people missed: respect. Despite rejecting Clint's offer and criticizing his darker take on the Western, John Wayne never publicly belittled Eastwood as an actor. And Clint? He never once trashed Wayne, even when the comparisons painted him as a counterpunch to everything the Duke believed in. That's the thing about Clint Eastwood. He doesn't waste words. When he does speak, it matters. Privately, Clint acknowledged what John Wayne had done for cinema. In interviews over the years, he's described Wayne as the biggest star of his time and someone who knew exactly what audiences wanted. But Clint also made it clear he wasn't interested in wearing someone else's boots. He wasn't trying to dethrone the Duke. He was just trying to tell stories that felt honest to him. And if you dig a little deeper, it becomes obvious. Eastwood's redefinition of the Western wasn't just rebellion. It was evolution. He didn't set out to destroy the house John Wayne built. He simply started building a new one on the edge of the same frontier. In fact, some of Clint's characters could be seen as spiritual descendants of Wayne's, only stripped of the polish and weighed down by the emotional aftermath. There's also this: Clint Eastwood came from a generation that grew up watching John Wayne. As a young man, he saw Wayne dominate the big screen. He watched Stagecoach. He studied The Searchers. And while his own career would later challenge those very films, he never denied their impact. In a way, Wayne was the mountain, and Eastwood, rather than trying to tear it down, chose to climb higher. That quiet respect extended into Eastwood's approach to legacy. While Wayne's image became preserved in Americana and museums, Eastwood stayed fluid. He didn't want to be a statue. He wanted to keep creating, adapting, experimenting. But the work never stopped honoring where it all began. Every time Clint saddled up for another Western, he didn't know who came before him. And even though John Wayne never lived to see Clint Eastwood's full transformation into a directorial force, it's hard to imagine he wouldn't have felt something about it. Maybe disapproval, maybe pride, maybe both. Because for all their differences, they had one unshakable thing in common: they loved the Western. They believe in its power to shape stories, heroes, and even nations. And now, decades later, with Wayne long gone and Clint in the twilight of his career, something unexpected happened. Eastwood finally decided to say what he really thought. For decades, Clint Eastwood kept his thoughts on John Wayne mostly to himself. Sure, there were the occasional respectful nods in interviews, but nothing deep, nothing revealing. He never weighed in on the supposed rivalry, never fired back at Wayne's criticisms of his work, and never gave the public the closure it craved. That is, until recently. At 94 years old, Clint Eastwood finally opened up. And while he didn't deliver some fiery monologue or take a victory lap for outlasting the Duke, his words were more powerful because of their simplicity. When asked directly about John Wayne during a conversation about the evolution of film, Clint leaned back and said, "John was a giant. But every generation has to find its own truth." That one sentence said everything. He wasn't dismissing Wayne. He wasn't trying to compete. He was acknowledging the impact, while gently pulling the curtain back on why their visions had to be different. To Clint, John Wayne represented a chapter. A big, bold, unforgettable chapter. But the story had to keep going. And for viewers and fans who'd waited decades for that moment, it was a quiet gut punch. Because it confirmed what many suspected, Clint Eastwood never hated John Wayne. He respected him, but he also knew that the world Wayne symbolized didn't match the complexity of the one Clint grew up in. Wayne portrayed America as it wanted to see itself. Clint portrayed America as it was struggling to understand itself. Even more telling was what Eastwood didn't say. He didn't defend himself against Wayne's criticisms. He didn't justify his choices as a filmmaker. He didn't need to. At this stage in his life, Clint knows the work speaks louder than any argument ever could. And by finally speaking up, he wasn't reigniting a rivalry. He was closing a chapter with grace. But the interview didn't stop there. When asked whether he ever wished they had worked together, Clint paused for a long time and simply said, "It would have been interesting." That's it. No elaboration, no dramatics. Just a quiet recognition of what could have been, and maybe, just maybe, a little bit of regret. Because despite all their differences, Clint and the Duke were two sides of the same coin. They both carried the weight of American masculinity on their backs. They both shaped generations of men who didn't just watch movies, they modeled themselves after them. And they both left behind legacies that would forever be linked, whether they liked it or not. Now, with time having done what it always does, softening some edges and sharpening others, Eastwood's comment lands differently. It doesn't sound like rivalry. It sounds like resolution. But there was still one final piece to the puzzle, a story Clint had never shared until now, one that pulled back the curtain on the real moment between him and the Duke. For years, fans speculated about whether Clint Eastwood and John Wayne had any personal exchanges beyond the infamous script rejection. Most assumed that once Wayne declined High Plains Drifter and made his views known, that was the end of it. But buried beneath the surface of Hollywood legend lies a lesser-known moment, one that Eastwood only recently revealed. And it wasn't loud. It wasn't public. It came in the form of a letter. After Wayne passed away in 1979, many of his peers publicly mourned the loss. Tributes poured in from all over the world, honoring the man who'd come to symbolize rugged American heroism. But Clint Eastwood didn't make a grand statement. He didn't appear on talk shows. Instead, he sat down and wrote a letter, privately, and with the kind of restraint that only Eastwood could master. Years later, during a quiet interview reflecting on the passing of industry legends, Clint casually mentioned the note. "I didn't feel the need to say anything on camera," he said. "I wrote him a letter. Told him what I thought." When pressed further, Clint declined to read the letter or share all its contents, but he offered one sentence that stood out. "I told him he helped build something strong, and I hoped I could carry part of it forward." That single admission hit harder than any tribute ever could. It wasn't just about respect, it was about legacy. Even after being criticized by the Duke, even after forging a completely different cinematic path, Clint still took the time to honor the man who came before him. And that letter, unpublicized and unreciprocated, said everything about the kind of man Eastwood really is. But there's more. According to those close to Eastwood, he kept a photo of John Wayne in one of his private offices, not on display for fans, but tucked into a corner, surrounded by other Western memorabilia. It wasn't a shrine. It wasn't sentimental. It was a reminder of where it all started, of the shoulders he stood on, and maybe of the weight that came with rewriting the myth. It's easy to pit legends against each other. Audiences crave conflict. They want drama. But sometimes the real story is quieter and far more powerful. In Clint's case, it wasn't about outshining John Wayne. It was about moving the story forward without forgetting who started the first chapter. The letter, like much of Eastwood's life, was never meant for the spotlight. It wasn't a PR move. It was a final silent handshake between two icons who never stood on the same set, but who shared the same dust, the same boots, and the same burden of representing the American man. But as Clint approaches the end of a legendary career, one question still lingers. Did he finally settle the debate about who truly defined the Western? As Clint Eastwood approaches his 94th birthday, the question that has dogged his entire career, especially in comparison to John Wayne, still lingers in the minds of fans. Who truly won the West? Was it the heroic, invincible cowboy who defined American ideals through a lens of unwavering patriotism and strength? Or was it the grizzled, morally complex figure who forced audiences to confront the darker side of heroism and human nature? In many ways, this isn't just a question about film or legacy. It's a question about America itself, what it values, how it evolves, and how it sees itself through the lens of popular culture. John Wayne's America was one where good always triumphed, where right and wrong were clear-cut, and where the frontier was a place to forge unshakable destinies. He embodied the classic, almost mythical vision of the American dream, untouched by self-doubt or nuance. His characters didn't question their actions, and the world around them was structured and simple. But Clint Eastwood's West was one that asked hard questions. His characters were morally gray. They carried scars, some visible, some buried deep, and they never saw the world in black and white. In Clint's films, the lines between good and bad were constantly blurred, and his characters were never given the luxury of certainty. Whether it was the reluctant anti-hero of Unforgiven, the tortured cop in Dirty Harry, or the wounded veteran in Gran Torino, Eastwood's protagonists were defined by the complex world they inhabited, one where violence, regret, and redemption walked hand in hand. So, who won the West? It's clear that the answer isn't simple. John Wayne's West is the West of myth, the one where the cowboy always saves the day, and America's strength is never questioned. Clint Eastwood, on the other hand, gave us a new West, a world where even the hero has blood on his hands, where no one truly escapes their past, and where the American dream is constantly being re-examined. And now, looking back on their respective careers, Clint Eastwood finally seems at peace with this complex question. It's not about who won the West. It's about what that West means to each generation. Clint has said time and time again that movies are a reflection of the times in which they're made. And while Wayne's Westerns may have defined the era of post-war optimism and strength, Eastwood's Westerns reflected the turbulent, questioning spirit of the 1960s and beyond. In Eastwood's eyes, the West isn't about a clear victory. It's about the stories that emerge from the struggle. The West, as he portrayed it, is still a land of possibility, but it's a place where the past never truly leaves. It stays with you, shaping your decisions, your fate, and your understanding of right and wrong. The winner, Clint suggests, is whoever can tell the most honest story about that struggle. And in that sense, perhaps Clint Eastwood did win the West. Not through accolades, or through the films that made him a box office titan, but through the stories that forced audiences to reflect on their own understanding of America, of masculinity, and of heroism. His victory wasn't in triumphing over Wayne's style. It was in telling a deeper, more complicated version of the same story. A version that, in the end, spoke just as loudly, if not louder. As Clint Eastwood enters the final stretch of his remarkable life, one thing is clear: he has outlived many of his contemporaries, including the legendary John Wayne. And yet, despite all the years that have passed, Clint's thoughts on Wayne, their careers, their differences, and their shared legacy are just as relevant today as they were decades ago. It's a testament to the enduring power of their films, their characters, and the way they captured the essence of a changing America. But with Clint now in his 90s, many are asking, what's left to say about John Wayne and Clint Eastwood? After all, the feud, if it was ever truly won, has been laid to rest, and Clint's own career is winding down. So, what is the final word on their complicated relationship? What can we take away from the years of silence, respect, and rivalry? The answer, it seems, is that Clint Eastwood has already said everything that needs to be said. His films, his interviews, and now his final introspective reflections on John Wayne tell a complete story. Clint has never been one to indulge in excess or fanfare. He has always chosen to let his work speak for itself. And in his later years, as he steps back from the spotlight, that work has become even more meaningful. It stands as a living tribute to both his own legacy and the one he inherited from Wayne. In his quiet, unassuming way, Clint has made peace with the past. He's acknowledged Wayne's monumental impact while carving his own path through the unforgiving terrain of Hollywood. There is no bitterness in his words, no hidden animosity. Instead, Clint's reflections are a reminder that the greatest artists understand that legacy is not about who takes the throne. It's about how we shape the stories that outlive us. As Eastwood continues to live out his final years, it's hard not to think about the stories that still remain untold. The films he made, the characters he portrayed, and the truths he uncovered about the human condition. He may be 94, but the man who captured the complexities of the American West will never truly fade from view. In many ways, Clint Eastwood and John Wayne represent two sides of the same coin. One painted the myth of the American hero, the other tore it apart to reveal the flaws beneath. Together, they shaped the Western genre, each in his own way. And although Clint may never fully resolve the debate over who was better for the West, one thing is certain: their shared contribution to American cinema and culture is undeniable. So, as the curtain falls on Clint Eastwood's legendary career, let's remember what truly matters: the stories that live on long after the credits roll. And while John Wayne may have carved out the first chapter of the Western, Clint Eastwood will forever be the one who showed us how to live with the consequences of that legacy. For Clint, it's never been about outshining the past, it's about carrying it forward. And with his recent words about John Wayne, it's clear Clint Eastwood's true victory lies in the way he shaped the West, not just for himself, but for generations to come. And there you have it, Clint Eastwood's final thoughts on John Wayne, and how at 94 he's finally given us a glimpse into the complex bond between the two Hollywood titans. It wasn't a fiery battle of egos, but a quiet acknowledgement of respect, legacy, and the stories that define us. As Clint moves forward in his final years, his impact on the Western genre and American cinema as a whole is undeniable. So, what do you think? Who truly won the West, the mythic hero or the morally complex anti-hero? And if you enjoyed this deep dive into the world of Clint Eastwood and John Wayne, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you won't miss more stories like this. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.